Marissa Vane broke the lock on Everett Caldwell's farmhouse over an assessment fee he had never agreed to, certain she had just brought a stubborn farmer to heel. 3 days later, Everett walked into a meeting, set a folder of Silverbrier's financial records on the table, and revealed that his fund controlled the very construction loan keeping the community alive. Marissa had used a fraudulent seizure as loan collateral, triggering a default clause buried deep in the credit agreement. One signature from Everett and the money that built Silverbrier would vanish, while Marissa's authority would collapse into criminal evidence. Everett drove back to Caldwell Farmhouse after 3 days away, on business in Richmond. Long before he reached the house, he noticed that the old wooden gate at the end of his dirt driveway had been replaced with a heavy chain and a red plastic sign reading that the property had been seized by the Silverbrier Homeowners Association. A patrol vehicle belonging to the community's private security team sat parked near the porch, and 2 men in matching jackets were carrying boxes of his belongings toward a metal storage container. Marissa stood on the front steps in a white blazer holding a folder thick with paperwork, and she told him without a trace of hesitation that he owed the association more than $37,000 in unpaid dues, landscaping, penalties, and legal fees. Everett did not raise his voice. He asked her calmly, what document gave the association any claim over land his family had owned since 1948? Marissa pointed toward the distant entrance of Silverbrier and explained that his property had been folded into the community's expansion zone 3 years earlier, that notices had been sent and ignored, and that the association, therefore, had every right to take possession until the debt was rated BS. Settled. When Everett asked to see the signed agreement, the county-approved subdivision mapped the recorded lien or a court order authorizing forced entry, she produced nothing but a stack of photocopies and told him the window for objection had already closed. He noticed the splintered frame of his own front door, the filing cabinet in his study, pried open and papers scattered across the floor as though someone had been searching for something specific rather than simply cataloging his possessions. He photographed everything in silence, then called his attorney, Audrey Whitlock. Before he left his own land under armed escort, he told Marissa that she had not just walked into the wrong house, but had reached into a financial agreement far larger than the community she believed she controlled. She laughed and ordered the security team to walk him off the property as though he were a trespasser, rather than the man whose grandfather had cleared the very fields Silverbrier was built beside. That evening, sitting in his truck at the end of the driveway he could no longer enter, Everett opened a file on his laptop titled Silverbrier Master Credit Facility, controlled by Caldwell Meridian Capital, and began reading through terms he had written himself 18 months earlier. The next morning, Audrey met Everett at the county records office to trace the full legal history of the farmhouse. What they found confirmed everything he already suspected. The Caldwell family had held clear title to the land since 1948. The farmhouse had never been included in any Silverbrier plat, never carried a restrictive covenant tying it to the association, and had no recorded agreement bearing Everett's signature. The lien Marissa's team had filed was barely 6 weeks old, and the legal description attached to it contained boundary errors no competent surveyor would have made. Audrey discovered that Marissa had built her claim around a document titled Supplemental Annexation Agreement, supposedly signed by Everett, though he insisted he had never seen the page in his life. The signature bore an unsettling resemblance to one he had given 2 years earlier, granting Silverbrier temporary use of his farm road to move construction materials. Everett suspected the signature had simply been lifted and pasted onto a new page. Meanwhile, Marissa sent a community-wide message announcing that the association had successfully reclaimed a long-neglected property and that the farmhouse would soon become a guest lodge for the board, an event space, or an expanded management office, depending on which version of the plan. She felt like promoting that week. She seemed determined to turn the seizure into a political win ahead of the upcoming board election, framing herself as the woman who had finally brought an outsider's land under proper community control. Nadine Foster, a longtime resident and retired bank accountant, read the message with a growing sense of unease, since she remembered the farmhouse standing decades before Silverbrier's first foundation was poured. When she raised the question on the community forum, her post vanished within the hour, and her account was locked without explanation. Everett and Audrey went to the sheriff's office to report the break-in, but Sheriff Colton Pierce explained that since the association had produced a lien on paper, he could not yet call it theft. Everett did not argue. He simply asked Colton to preserve every second of body camera footage from the officers who had responded that day, and Audrey filed for an emergency injunction barring the association from altering, selling, or discarding anything on the property. While reviewing the inventory of items removed from the house, Everett noticed that a small fireproof file safe was missing entirely, a safe that had once held copies of financial agreements tied to Silverbrier's own development. Its absence told him this was not a simple fee dispute born of confusion. Someone inside the association already understood exactly who he was. He called Tessa Langford, a forensic auditor who had worked with his fund for years, and asked her to begin a full audit of every dollar moving through Silverbrier's accounts. Long before anyone in Silverbrier knew his name meant anything beyond a man who sold hay bales and mended fences, Everett had spent decades in commercial credit restructuring, buying distressed real estate loans from banks eager to walk away, and negotiating terms with developers who had run out of the feisty options. After his father died, he came home to manage the farmhouse, and the community that grew up beside his land only ever saw a quiet man in a faded jacket driving an old pickup truck. None of them knew he still ran Caldwell Meridian Capital from a small office tucked behind his barn, managing a portfolio worth far more than every house in Silverbrier combined. 18 months before Marissa broke his lock, the original bank financing, Silverbrier's construction, had grown desperate to exit the project as costs spiraled, and Everett's fund purchased the loan at a steep discount. That credit facility included the construction financing for 84 unfinished villas, the loans covering roads and drainage infrastructure, an operating line extended to Blaine Mercer's development company control over several reserve accounts, and a default clause allowing immediate recall of funds in the event of fraud or an unresolved ownership dispute. Everett had never lent directly to individual homeowners. His fund controlled the developer's financing and the unsold inventory of homes, which made the idea of canceling loans both accurate and devastating without touching a single family's private mortgage. Blaine knew Caldwell. Meridian held his construction debt, but he had never learned that the fund's founder was the same man, living quietly on the farm next door, since every prior negotiation had passed through attorneys and investment managers rather than face-to-face meetings. Tessa's early audit uncovered a private arrangement between the association and Blaine's company, in which the association promised to acquire the farmhouse after seizure. Blaine would build a second clubhouse on the land, the association would pledge future resident fees as security, and Blaine's firm intended to use the farmhouse itself to inflate the value of assets already pledged against his loan. Most damning of all, Blaine had already submitted an appraisal of the farmhouse to his lender, despite never holding any legal claim to it. Everett realized the seizure had never been one woman's impulsive overreach. It was a calculated patch for a much larger financial hole opening beneath Silverbrier's final construction phase. Marissa had simply moved faster than the plan intended, convinced that a fabricated lien would be enough to make an aging farmer surrender without a fight. Everett could have triggered the default clause the moment he confirmed the fraud, but he held back, unwilling to let innocent homeowners absorb damage meant for the people exploiting them. He told Tessa that their goal was never to destroy the community, only to separate the residents living inside it from the people using those residents as a shield. By the end of that week, Tessa found a transfer of $95,000 from the association's operating account to a company registered at the same address as Marissa's private residence. Despite the injunction Audrey had already filed, Marissa hosted a small gathering at the farmhouse to prove publicly that the association now controlled the property outright. She invited board members, representatives from Blaine's development firm, a handful of real estate agents, a local newspaper reporter, and a contractor eager for new work. Marissa announced plans to tear down the old equipment shed, level the orchard behind the house, and build a $4.2 million recreation center in its place, describing the farmhouse as an eyesore the community had finally been freed from tolerating. Nadine attended as a resident and quietly recorded a conversation between Marissa and Blaine near the porch, in which Marissa assured him that once the farmhouse was reappraised, he would finally have enough collateral to secure funding for the final phase of construction. Blaine warned that the transfer of title was not yet complete, but Marissa waved off the concern, insisting that a farmer with no money could never afford to fight them in court. She then ordered the contractor to remove the weathered sign reading Caldwell Farm, established 1948, from the entrance gate, an act that struck at something deeply personal without needing to become a lingering story of the grief, since it only sharpened Everett's resolve rather than softening the narrative into nostalgia. Audrey secured a temporary restraining order from a judge that same afternoon and arrived at the farmhouse with Sheriff Colton to deliver it in person. Marissa reacted furiously, insisting the judge had no understanding of the association's authority and tried to block the sheriff's entry by summoning her private security detail. Colton warned her plainly that obstructing a court order could result in her own arrest, and the gathering dissolved in front of the very reporter Marissa had invited to document her triumph. She pivoted instantly, telling anyone who would listen that Everett was using money and influence to bully an entire neighborhood. A narrative she repeated that same night in a special assessment notice, demanding $12,000 from every household to fund the association's coming legal battle. Panic spread quickly through Silverbrier as residents who had already stretched their budgets to cover rising maintenance fees now faced a decision they never voted on. Nadine forwarded her recording to Audrey the following morning, and Tessa confirmed that the $95,000 transfer had gone to a company called Vane Community Consulting, registered under Marissa's sister's name, but with no employees. no office, and no discernible business activity. That evening, Everett signed a formal reservation of rights notice, quietly warning the developer that any fraud connected to ownership disputes could jeopardize the entire credit facility, keeping the project alive. Determined to control the narrative and push through her special assessment, Marissa called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse, packing the room with residents eager for answers. She sat on a small stage beside Graham Hollis, the association's longtime legal counsel, and Blaine Mercer, presenting Everett to the crowd as a speculator trying to sabotage property values out of spite. When Everett arrived with Audrey and Tessa dressed as plainly as always, Marissa mocked him from the podium, telling him this was a homeowners meeting and not a farmer's market, but Everett simply replied that he had come because residents were being billed for a seizure they had never approved. Nadine stood and demanded answers. Marissa clearly did not want to give who had approved annexing the farmhouse, why residents were never allowed to vote, who had received the $95,000 pulled from association funds, and why future resident fees had been pledged as security for Bowen after a Sexantine.com, Blaine's private construction loan. Marissa refused to answer and ordered security to remove Nadine from the room, a decision that visibly unsettled several people watching from the audience. Everett placed a copy of the original credit agreement on the table and explained without theatrics that Caldwell Meridian Capital now controlled the very loan financing Silverbrier's development, and Blaine's face drained of color the moment he recognized the signature authorizing the loan's transfer. Marissa still refused to believe Everett held any real authority, insisting he had simply pulled documents from the safe her team had confiscated from his house. Everett called Tessa forward to confirm his role as founder and controlling shareholder of the fund, displaying corporate filings that left no room for doubt. He then outlined 3 preliminary violations uncovered in the audit: falsifying ownership of the farmhouse within collateral filings, diverting association funds to a company tied to Marissa's family, and failing to disclose a material legal dispute to the fund holding the development loan. Under the terms of that agreement, the fund had the right to suspend disbursements, recall the entire credit line, freeze reserve accounts, demand new project management, and begin proceedings to take control of the unfinished development altogether. Marissa insisted the association operated independently from the development company, and that Everett therefore had no power over her personally. But Everett pointed out that she herself had signed agreements pledging association revenue, and the farmhouse as part of the same financial plan she now claimed had nothing to do with her. He was not canceling ordinary homeowners' mortgages, he was suspending the developer's unused construction financing and revoking commitments extended to Blaine. He signed the suspension notice in front of the entire room, and within minutes Blaine's phone lit up with an email from the lending desk confirming that all further disbursements had been halted. Contractors would go unpaid, the final phase could not continue, and Silverbrier suddenly faced the very real possibility of falling under outside receivership. Before leaving, Everett told the stunned crowd that Marissa had seized his house to protect her project, only to strip that project of the money keeping it alive. In the days that followed, the Silverbrier construction site fell nearly silent. Contractors pulled their equipment, unfinished villas sat locked and empty, and the landscaping company threatened to stop service entirely unless overdue invoices were paid. Residents grew angry, but their anger split in different directions. Some convinced Everett was punishing an entire neighborhood out of spite. Others slowly realizing Marissa had hidden serious financial risk behind confident announcements, and new homeowners terrified that their closing contracts might collapse before they ever moved in. Everett organized a smaller gathering at his own barn, inviting residents to hear the situation explained plainly, rather than through Marissa's carefully worded emails. He told them that homes already purchased legally were never at risk of seizure, that individual mortgages remained entirely outside his fund's control, and that the suspension applied only to development funds that had not yet been released. He offered to restore financing on 4 conditions. The farmhouse had to be returned immediately. Marissa and anyone connected to the fraud had to be suspended from their positions. An independent auditor needed full access to every account, and Blaine's company had to formally abandon any claim to Caldwell land. Nadine began organizing residents to demand a recall vote against the entire board, and Marissa responded by locking her out of the clubhouse, issuing fines against anyone displaying protest signs, assigning security to follow Everett around the property line, and attempting to destroy internal.com financial records before anyone could examine them. A management employee, uneasy about what she had witnessed, secretly forwarded Audrey an internal email showing that Marissa had instructed staff to alter the date on the farmhouse annexation document after the fact. Graham Hollis discovered his own name attached to a legal confirmation letter he had never signed, and the realization that Marissa may have forged his signature as easily as she had forged Everett's left him deeply shaken. He met privately with Everett, offering to cooperate in protecting the residents caught in the middle, and Everett asked nothing more of him than to preserve every document and fulfill his actual legal obligations, rather than his loyalty to Everett. Marissa. When Marissa learned that Graham was quietly helping secure evidence, she fired him that same night and ordered the association's servers wiped, unaware that Tessa had already filed a legal preservation request with the hosting company hours earlier. With a court order in hand, citing the risk of destroyed evidence, Sheriff Colton and a forensic technician arrived at the association office to seize computers and files. Inside a locked cabinet behind Marissa's desk, they found an expired notary stamp, several conflicting drafts of the farmhouse annexation agreement, a scanned copy of Everett's signature lifted from an unrelated document, invoices for document alterations, and the missing fireproof safe taken like pyre from the farmhouse itself. Marissa insisted the safe had simply come along with lawfully seized property, though opening it and copying its contents went far beyond any reasonable claim of fee collection. A handwriting expert confirmed that the signature on the annexation agreement had been cut and layered from the earlier road access permit Everett had genuinely signed, and the notary stamp used to authenticate the document belonged to an employee who had left the company months before the public. Paperwork was supposedly notarized. Tessa recovered a buried email exchange in which Blaine warned Marissa that if Caldwell ever discovered the farmhouse had been used in loan documentation, the entire facility would be called due immediately. Marissa's reply was blunt. He had no idea who truly controlled the loan, and by the time he found out, the house would already belong to them. The message proved beyond doubt that Marissa understood exactly who Everett was, and had gambled that seizing his home would strip away his ability to fight back. Tessa's completed audit painted a damning picture. $95,000, funneled to a company tied to Marissa's family, $140,000 in legal fees, with no valid invoices attached, $63,000 spent on a private security detail too, $110,000 pulled from reserve funds to support the clubhouse expansion, and dozens of selectively enforced fines targeting residents who dared to question her leadership. Facing the weight of this evidence, Blaine requested a private meeting with Everett and admitted the project was short nearly $7 million needed to reach completion, warning that without restored funding, his company would collapse entirely. He tried to place the blame squarely on Marissa's shoulders, but Everett reminded him that he had personally signed the false appraisal and allowed the farmhouse to be listed as collateral he never actually controlled. Everett offered blow to this. Perdit, to the injuvis, to this plain abandon, to the farmhouse. Accept new oversight over the project, or watch the entire outstanding loan balance, more than $40 million, get called due immediately. Blaine asked for 24 hours to decide. That same night, Marissa filed for personal bankruptcy and attempted to shift ownership of her private home into a trust designed to shield it from creditors, a move Tessa caught within minutes of its filing. The formal hearing drew reporters and a packed gallery of Silverbrier residents eager to see how far the truth would reach. Marissa arrived with new counsel and a carefully rehearsed defense, arguing that the board had genuinely believed the annexation document was valid, that she had acted in the community's interest, that Everett had wielded his financial power unfairly, and that suspending the loan had caused damage far beyond what the situation warranted. Audrey laid out the case methodically. The farmhouse had never belonged to the association. Everett's signature had been copied from another document entirely. The notarization was fraudulent. The association broke into the home before any legal claim existed. Personal files and property were removed without authority. Marissa had used land she did not own to secure financing, and association funds had been diverted to a company connected to her own family. Graham took the stand and confirmed that Marissa had used his name and electronic signature without permission on official documents. Nadine's recording played for the courtroom, capturing Marissa's own words about using the farmhouse to unlock financing for Blaine. In the end, Blaine chose full cooperation, confirming under oath that Marissa had proposed seizing the farmhouse specifically to inflate the value of land earmarked for the clubhouse, promising in return to help her maintain control of the board. Marissa's attorney attempted one final attack, suggesting Everett had deliberately concealed his ownership of the loan to entrap her, but Everett calmly replied that a borrower's ignorance of who truly holds their debt never plagues, suggesting excuses fraud committed against that lender. The judge ruled decisively. The annexation of the farmhouse was declared void. The association's lien was struck from the record. Full ownership was restored to Everett immediately. The association was ordered to cover repair costs and legal fees, and every fraudulent document was referred directly to the prosecutor's office. Marissa was permanently barred from the farmhouse and from any further access to association records. Moments after the ruling, Sheriff Colton stood and announced Marissa's arrest on charges including document forgery, use of a fraudulent notarization, theft of property, unlawful entry, financial fraud, and obstruction of evidence preservation. She turned to the board members, seated behind her, demanding their support, but one by one they looked away. As deputies led her from the courtroom, she shouted that Everett had destroyed Silverbrier with his own hands. He answered simply that he had only cut off the money. She was the one who had broken the foundation long before he arrived. With Marissa in custody, Everett faced a decision about the fate of the loan itself. Under the terms of the credit agreement, he had every right to declare the entire balance, due immediately, seize the undeveloped land, outright replace the management company by force, or sell the project wholesale to another investor. Choosing the harshest path would strip Blaine of his company entirely and likely bury Silverbrier in years of litigation that would punish people who had done nothing wrong. Nadine and a small group of residents met Everett at the newly returned farmhouse not to ask for leniency toward the guilty but to ask that innocent families not be made to pay for a scheme they never approved. Everett laid out a plan for restructuring rather than destruction. Blaine would step down from operational control of the project entirely. A new development firm would take over the final construction phase under strict financial oversight. Disbursements would flow through direct supervision rather than unchecked developer access. The association would hold new board elections. An independent auditor would publish a full accounting for every resident to review. Retaliatory fines would be erased, misappropriated reserve funds would be repaid, and the farmhouse together, with its surrounding 214 acres, would be permanently and formally recognized as land outside the association's boundaries forever. He did not forgive the debt already dispersed, since that money had already built real homes people were living in. Instead, he canceled the old credit line that had financed a corrupt system of management and replaced it with a new agreement carrying far stricter conditions. A distinction that mattered enormously since it meant he had genuinely canceled the loans financing the community's old, rotten structure while still allowing honest homeowners to keep their houses. Blaine surrendered control of the project and agreed to use personal assets to help cover a portion of the damage caused. Residents voted almost unanimously to remove the entire old board, and Nadine accepted a temporary role as interim chair, insisting on serving only 6 months, just long enough to guide the community toward a transparent election. A restitution fund was established using proceeds from the association's liability insurance, recovered assets tied to Marissa's shell company, mandatory contributions from Blaine, and unused funds originally earmarked for abandoned clubhouse expansion. Repairs began on the farmhouse almost immediately, and the old wooden sign reading Caldwell Farm was restored to its original post at the entrance. When residents suggested turning Everett's farm road into a second entrance for Silverbrier, he declined, wanting a clear and permanent boundary between his land and theirs, one that no future board could quietly erase with a forged signature and a fresh coat of paint. 6 months later, Silverbrier looked like a different community entirely. Construction resumed under new financial oversight, and the unfinished villas were completed without ever needing the farmhouse as collateral for anything. The association's governing rules were rewritten from the ground up. Any lien required independent legal verification spending, above a set threshold required. A resident vote board members had to disclose conflicts of interest publicly. Private security could no longer be deployed to handle civil disputes. Residents gained guaranteed access to financial records, and the association lost any unilateral power to expand its own boundaries. Graham helped the new board design its compliance procedures, but chose not to return as permanent counsel, admitting openly that he had looked away from Marissa's methods for far too long before finally acting. Blaine sold most of his ownership stake in the development company to cover his share of the damages, and while he avoided the criminal charges Marissa now faced because of his cooperation, his reputation and career never fully recovered. Marissa remained in custody, awaiting trial. Her assets frozen, after the court ruled her attempted trust transfer had been a deliberate effort to shield property from creditors. Caldwell Meridian recovered the funds that had been misused, and Everett quietly redirected a portion of the restitution toward restoring a stretch of wetland sitting between his farmhouse and the Silverbrier Gate. At the ceremony reopening the community's main entrance, Nadine invited Everett to attend, and he stood just outside the gate, not because anyone barred him but because he chose to remain where he had always belonged. Nadine handed him a small wooden sign reading Caldwell Farm Independent since 1948, and he mounted it on his newly repaired fence line himself. When a resident asked why he hadn't simply taken control of all of Silverbrier while he had the power to do it, Everett answered that power was never about how much a person could seize, but about knowing precisely what needed to be taken away from someone who had abused it. That evening, Everett sat on his porch and watched a crew remove the old association camera that had once been aimed directly at his land. In the distance, the Silverbrier gate still stood exactly where it always had, but it no longer carried the weight of Marissa's authority behind it. It was simply a gate again. The farmhouse remained his standing quietly on the same ground his family had held since 1948, and the very money that had once fueled an entire homeowner's empire had become the instrument that finally forced that empire into the light. An organization can hide behind bylaws, hired attorneys, and armed patrols, but no amount of paperwork can turn forged signatures into legitimate ownership. Marissa did not lose because Everett had more money than she did. She lost because he understood that financial power only means something when it rests on evidence, patience, and the plain truth of who actually owns what. Everett never saved Silverbrier by overlooking what had been done there. He saved it by cutting the money away from the people who had abused it, forcing an entire community to rebuild itself from honest ground up.